Welcome everyone to the series of Gaza in Context, the colonial history that shaped the Middle East. Today is session 4, part 4, called Looking in the Mirror. And I would like to reintroduce Jeff Klein, the scholar and activist who has been with us all along. So thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks everyone for being with us. I'm going to use slides again, so hopefully that will work. And okay, so I presume you can see that screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, as I have said repeatedly, these sessions are not primarily about current events, but the historical and political background to what we're all following today. But of course, it's impossible to go on without recognizing, at least, in passing, what's happening today. And of course, the big news is so far the ceasefire, at least phase 1, is holding, and hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza are returning to the northern part of the Gaza Strip, even though most of their homes have been destroyed. But returning home is an act of resistance, in effect. And, we can only hope, but not be sure that Israel will allow the other phases of the ceasefire agreement to take effect. Israel's track record in this regard is not encouraging, but there are international pressures and domestic political pressures within Israel that may force it to abide by a longer-term ceasefire. And of course, while there's a ceasefire in Gaza that is mostly holding, Israel has been ramping up its settler and military attacks in the West Bank. And this is a picture of Jenin in the northern part of the West Bank, where Israel is now using, for the first time in recent months, tactics that are reminiscent of Gaza. That is aerial strikes, drones, blowing up buildings, destroying neighborhoods, and so on. So a reminder that although there may be a ceasefire that's holding in Gaza, Israel by no means is maintaining its ceasefire in the rest of occupied Palestine. Now, just want to step back a little bit and review the last couple of sessions. I pointed out that although Israel looms very large in U.S. policy toward the Middle East today, that wasn't always the case. And long before Israel existed, the oil resources of the Middle East were the main strategic interest of the United States. That has lessened over the years, partly as a result of nationalization of Saudi Aramco and other, locally run petro countries. But it's still a significant interest strategically and in terms of profit. Again, even though Saudi Aramco is nationalized, U.S. oil companies and petroleum service countries still accrue enormous profits from exploiting of oil in the Middle East. And of course, it's still a strategic commodity that the U.S. has an interest in sort of having control of. The other leg of the U.S. long-term involvement in the Middle East, of course, was the Cold War and competition with the then Soviet Union for influence and control in what was called the Third World in those days. Of course, with the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s, 1990s, this has become, basically an obsolete pretext for U.S. involvement in the Middle East. So Israel, as a sort of strategic and political ally in the Middle East, looms ever larger as the basis for U.S. presence in the Middle East. Now, going back to Gaza itself, remember, I remind you how small it is. It's only 20 miles or so long and 4 or 5 or 6 miles at various points wide. And it probably could have been conquered and occupied by Israel in 1948 because the pre and post state military of the Zionists was preponderant and much more powerful than all the Arab neighbors that were fighting it. But again, it would have involved incorporating a small territory that was packed with refugees from 1948 Israel. So they essentially refrained from annexing the Gaza Strip in 1948, just as they refrained from annexing what we now call the West Bank, the occupied West Bank in 1948. They could have done that also, but it would have involved establishing a larger Palestinian Arab population within Israeli-controlled territory. So anyone who's been to the area knows that the Green Line, that was the armistice line in 1949, stops just on the outskirts of some major Arab population centers in the West Bank. Israel could have conquered them, but again, it would have meant annexing a large Arab population that at that time they didn't want to do. Remember, the Israeli Jewish population was much smaller then. Eventually, that became, this sort of achievable strategic goal, that is to conquer Gaza and the West Bank. And Israel was stronger then, had a larger Jewish population through immigration and natural increase, and of course had decreased its Arab population considerably during the Nakba. So Israel, of course, in the famous Six-Day War, conquered the West Bank, Sinai, including the Gaza Strip, and part of Syria. Just note that even before Israel actively occupied Gaza, it raided the Gaza Strip a number of times and carried out massacres in 1955, 56, and various times afterwards. But it was definitively in 1967 that Greater Israel, as we know it today, was formed, particularly after the peace treaty with Egypt, and they gave up very, very reluctantly. They gave up their occupied Sinai Peninsula. And again, people question this. The mythology that many of us grew up with was that Israel was attacked by all its neighbors and was struggling to defend itself from being pushed into the sea. And of course, the reality, which was acknowledged by Israeli leaders and is universally understood by historians, is that Syria and Egypt had no intention of launching a large-scale attack on Israel, and that Israel decided to take the opportunity to destroy the military capability of two of its most important opponents and neighbors. So that's just what happened, and you could look it up if you need to. Israel took the opportunity to preemptively destroy its neighbor. It's not defending itself in 1967. And in the decade or so after the conquest of the West Bank and Gaza, Israel launched its settlement program, that is moving Jewish Israelis into land taken from the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip at that time. And again, I emphasize that this settlement program, which of course has been in many occasions declared illegal under international law, was initiated by a labor-led government of Israel, and of course has been the sort of policy of both labor and right-wing Likud governments of Israel since then. They launched the settlements in the Gaza Strip under pressure from the far right in Israel, which again wanted to annex all of this conquered territory, but eventually realized it was just not worth the effort. It was very difficult to maintain a few settlements within this sea of Arab population. It required a lot of expense and security forces in the area to protect these settlements. So that in 2004-5, the right-wing government led by Ariel Sharon decided to remove its settlements from inside Gaza, while of course maintaining control from the outside of Gaza. And this was quite, explicitly done to reinforce Israel's control over the West Bank, which they did want to control and annex. And in effect, it's not something recent that we hear from the Likud governments of Israel that they will never allow a Palestinian state between the river and the sea. This was policy of the Likud party from its beginning. And the so-called disengagement from Gaza was explicitly meant, as Dov Weissglass, Sharon's advisor, said, to freeze the peace process and effectively remove indefinitely the idea of a Palestinian state. And that was Israeli policy in 2005 and remains Israeli policy today. And by the way, even the intervals of labor-led governments in Israel, no leader explicitly endorsed the idea of a fully sovereign Palestinian state in any of the occupied territories, even though, of course, it was under international law. This was an occupation that was supposed to be temporary and, of course, has been ruled illegal numerous times, including by the International Court of Justice. Now, following the removal of the Israeli settlements from inside Gaza, the Israelis effectively put the Gaza Strip under a long-term state of siege. If you look at the map, Israel controls 2 of the 3 land borders around Gaza, and of course, the sea off the coast. Egypt does control the southern border with Gaza, but it is obligated under the peace treaty with Israel to allow substantial Israeli control over who goes in and out of the Gaza Strip. And the Rafah crossing from Egypt was meant for civilian foot traffic and not for cargo. All the cargo that went into the Gaza Strip was directly controlled by Israel. So the idea that why doesn't Egypt allow stuff to get into Gaza? They are obligated under treaty not to do that. Again, the same disengagement, the brain behind the disengagement plan said that this siege was intended not to starve the Palestinians to death, but to make them hungry and thinner. This was Dov Weissglass. So there were very, very extreme restrictions on what could go in and out of the Gaza Strip, often arbitrary in terms of foodstuffs and supplies. And so between 2006 and the beginning of the current round of violence, Gaza was very depressed economically, very impoverished, and basically was becoming increasingly a difficult place to live in. Its water and sewage systems were repeatedly under attack. It was becoming a sort of uninhabitable zone, as the UN called it. And just, as a reminder, long before Israel's disengagement from Gaza and continuing right up to the period shortly before the Hamas-led attack out of Gaza, it was Israel's policy to encourage and support the idea of an Islamist rule in Gaza. The PLO was a secular national organization, and the Israelis calculated that separating Gaza from the rest of the occupied strip and supporting a religious Islamist political movement would divide the Palestinians. And of course, their intention was to keep that division, even though they were obligated under previous agreements to allow movement between Gaza and the West Bank. They effectively cut that off. And Netanyahu, this quote that you can see, whoever wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state needs to support the strengthening and financing of Hamas. That's part of our strategy. And that goes back to the 1980s when Hamas and its predecessor organizations were founded. The PLO was attacked, restricted, and harassed by the Israelis. They turned a blind eye to the growth of what became Hamas in the Gaza Strip in the 1980s and afterwards. Now, under pressure from the United States and Israel, the Palestinian Authority conducted elections for its legislative council in 2006. And much to the surprise and shock of everybody, Hamas, which was separate from the PLO and had previously denounced the so-called peace process between the Palestinian Authority and Israel and the United States, agreed indirectly to participate in those elections. Hamas didn't run itself, but they supported a party that was called Change and Reform, which was very appealing to Palestinians, both religious and not, because the Palestinian Authority under Israeli and U.S. control was notoriously corrupt and seemed to be making no progress toward the creation of an actual Palestinian state. So this Hamas-supported party received a majority in these legislative elections and were promptly suppressed. That is, they voted the wrong way, and therefore the Israelis, in coalition with the U.S. and the Palestinian Authority, basically arrested as many Hamas supporters as they could in the West Bank. But Hamas managed to keep control of Gaza as what they regarded to be the legitimate government as a result of this election. They didn't seize Gaza as a coup. Basically, the PA seized the West Bank as a coup, but weren't able to, eject Hamas from Gaza itself. And the result of this was, as often happens, we support elections and democracy as long as people vote the right way. And when they vote the wrong way, as many think tankers in Washington said, the Palestinians must pay a price for their choice. And of course, that price was an intensification of the siege of Gaza, followed by periodic attacks on Gaza. The first large-scale one was in 2008-9, where, by the way, there was a ceasefire in effect that the Israelis broke, and then periodic attacks on Gaza since then, even before the current breakout that led to the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And a reminder, they call this mowing the lawn. That is, up until recently, there wasn't much stomach for basically wiping out the population of Gaza, but they thought they could sort of mow the lawn periodically and sort of keep them down and keep them repressed by force. Of course, there was it caused a lot of death and suffering in Gaza, but as we learned from the last year and a half, it did not succeed in eliminating the support for resistance to Israel. Now, today, Israel, of course, controls the entirety of historic Palestine, from the river to the sea. And it's pretty clear that from the river to the sea, the majority of the population consists of Arabs, mostly Muslim, but also Christians and secular. And many Israelis admit this. They suggest there's it's either close to 50-50 or a small Arab majority. That may underestimate the disparity, because Israel counts as part of its population Jewish Israelis who have lived for a long time abroad and may or may not have any intention of returning home. So the actual disparity of people who live in historic Palestine is probably even more lopsided in terms of Arab majority, and a growing Arab majority. So who are the Palestinians? Basically and ironically, worldwide, there are about the same number of Palestinians as there are Jews. They're more concentrated, obviously, in Palestine, 1948 Israel and the occupied territories, and they have many different statuses. Most of the ones who don't live within Palestine live in the neighboring countries, principally Jordan, but also Syria and Lebanon, and a fair number in the diaspora, including the United States and South America, especially Chile. Chile has about 500,000 Palestinians living in it. And all of these Palestinians, the ones at least that live under Israeli control, have various limitations on their status. In theory, the 20% of the 1948 Israel population that is Arab are citizens. They do have the right to vote, but there are many legal impediments to their full participation as citizens, many laws that directly or indirectly discriminate against Arab citizens, so-called citizens of Israel. By definition, in a Jewish state, those who are not Jews have a secondary status, and there are many laws that sort of reinforce that. And of course, including regulations that allow Jewish communities to forbid Palestinians from living in many of the communities within Israel. In Jerusalem, the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that managed to stay after the Israeli conquest in 1967 are effectively green card holders in terms of the United States. They're not citizens, but they are legal residents. And but of course, they're constantly under threat. They're being scrutinized, and if for whatever reason they live outside of East Jerusalem, they're in danger of losing their resident status. In the West Bank, Palestinians are nominally represented by the Palestinian Authority, but in effect, Israel has complete control, and their movement and where they can live and what they can do in the West Bank is severely restricted, obviously even more so for the 2 million or so Palestinians that live in Gaza. They are not able to leave the Gaza Strip without the permission of Israel, and which has rarely been given. And of course, the exiled Palestinians outside have various statuses. Sometimes they're citizens of the countries where they live. Sometimes they have residence rights, and sometimes they are still living in refugee camps, as in Lebanon, for example. Now, you've all heard of the Oslo Accords. This was supposed to result in the creation of a sovereign and independent Palestinian state in the territories that were occupied by Israel in 1967, that is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And when it was signed, the timetable that was given was supposed to be 5 years of negotiations to resolve all the outstanding issues of borders, movement of population, and so on. And of course, during that period, that 5 years and after, Israel intensified its building and enlargement of settlements throughout the occupied territories. Again, all of that is illegal under uncontested international law. And of course, the 5 years after Oslo and no progress, in fact, things had gotten worse for most of the Palestinians, is what led to a growing support of Hamas as a form of resistance. Some of you, especially if you visited Palestine, you know that after 2000, the Israelis began building a fortified barrier, a wall throughout the West Bank to protect their settlements. And in the rural areas, it's more of a fence and a road and a ditch with electronic sensors. And in more urbanized areas, it's this wall, which many of you have seen. Again, the International Court of Justice has ruled that wall illegal wherever it enters the West Bank, and most of it is on the territory of the West Bank. And I show this picture as an example of the sort of lack of irony. This is what you see if you're approaching Bethlehem from Jerusalem. You have to go through a medieval-looking fortification. Even though Bethlehem is effectively a suburb of Jerusalem, Palestinians cannot go between those two places without a very elaborate application and permission from the Israeli authorities, which is mostly not given. And of course, whoever had the brainstorm of putting that sign, "Peace be with you," on this fortified apartheid wall doesn't understand what irony means. And of course, again, many of you know this. Obviously, there are Israeli checkpoints and walls in the area along the line that separates the West Bank from Israel, 1948 Israel proper. But there are checkpoints throughout the West Bank that limit and restrict movement of Palestinians even within the occupied territories. And periodically, depending on the political situation, these checkpoints are all closed and people basically cannot leave the cities or towns where they reside at all. When they can leave, they have to go through a humiliating and time-extensive process to get from one side of these Israeli checkpoints to another. Now, you've all seen this map. The Israelis go crazy when people show it, but it effectively, of course, it simplifies things a little bit, but it effectively illustrates the growth of Israeli control from the pre-state period, where Israeli-owned land is shown in white, to the UN proposed partition. Again, remember, with Jerusalem and Bethlehem supposed to be separate and under international control, which Israel has violated by annexing Jerusalem. And 1967, when the rest of historic Palestine was controlled by Israel through military means, and today, where Israel basically controls the whole of historic Palestine with pockets of Palestinian population, the Gaza Strip, and these broken up cantons in the West Bank. That's the situation today. We'll look at how that relates to American history shortly. So what's the end game? Obviously, the end game is for Israel to de facto control the entirety of historic Palestine. And here on the left, you see the UN proposed partition plan. And Netanyahu, maybe in a signal to his supporters, when he spoke at the UN a couple of years ago, he used this map, which shows Israel as all of historic Palestine. And even on the Israeli Foreign Affairs website, they have this illustration that shows Israel, including all the occupied territories, including this area of Syria, the Golan Heights, which they illegally annexed in the 1980s, that was not recognized by any country until Donald Trump a few years ago. So Israel clearly understands that it will permanently, from its point of view, permanently control all of historic Palestine. Whether they will make any, accommodation to local municipal self-rule within that, we don't know. But there's no evidence that they have any idea of fulfilling what they agreed to in Oslo and withdrawing from the occupied territories and allowing an independent Palestinian state. So here's what we can see. This is sort of the end game of Israel, that is controlling the whole thing with a few isolated and controlled population centers of Palestinians. And here on the right is a map of apartheid South Africa, which had the same idea, that is, to nominally restrict citizenship of native Africans to these Bantustans, as they were called, so that only white voters could control the majority. That's the situation in Israel today as well. Now, remember the first session, I talked about what could have been a different path. In 1919, an American commission sort of went to the Middle East to ask the people in the former Ottoman-controlled territories what they wanted. And of course, they wanted independence. And they recommended in the conclusion of their report that if the U.S. committed to supporting the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, remember, which always was a small minority of the population, they're committing the American people to the use of force in that area, since only by force can a Jewish state in Palestine be established or maintained. That report, of course, was prescient, but was repressed. And, it wasn't published till many years later, and very few Americans know anything about it. But what they predicted certainly came true. The U.S. has been militarily involved in the Middle East for generations, particularly the U.S. wars after 9/11 resulted in thousands of U.S. military deaths, the spending of enormous amounts of money. It's projected that the U.S. wars in the Middle East will cost in the long run something like $8 trillion in present and future costs. And of course, the cost paid by the indigenous inhabitants of the region was much heavier. Millions were killed in U.S. wars in the Middle East, and many more millions, according to the U.S., have been forced to flee from their homes in one manner or another due to U.S. Military intervention by Israel and its other allies. Looking today, the U.S. has a military presence of some kind in every single country of the Middle East, with the exception of Iran. Either troops deployed there, as shown in this map, or arms sales, military advisors, technical assistance to the local militaries. Basically, every single country in the Middle East has a U.S. military presence of some kind or another. And we call this region, the region we call the Middle East, the Pentagon calls the United States Central Command. And that's shown in color here. This is the sort of military platform for U.S. involvement in the Middle East. And CENTCOM, as it's called for short, has its headquarters in Tampa, Florida, 7,500 miles from the Middle East, and controls. We have a major fleet that has its port in Bahrain, and a huge military air base in Qatar, other bases in Kuwait, and so on. The U.S. is up to its neck in military involvement in the Middle East, to the detriment of not only the people there, but I would argue to the American people too. And just zooming back a little bit, this at the top shows the British Empire at its greatest extent. When the sun never set on the British Empire, most of that is gone today. But the U.S. has divided the entire planet. CENTCOM, which is here, is one of the military commands that divide up the entire globe. And we have 700 or 800 military bases scattered around the world. And you can see that map somewhat mirrors the map of the British Empire at its peak. We don't directly colonize, for the most part, as the British did, but we use indirect means to extend our military might in these areas, particularly military bases, alliances with local elites, mostly non-democratic, and arms sales, and so on. All of this does not come cheap. The military spending as a percentage of the federal budget that's appropriated every year is considerably more than half. This is the government that Congress votes on. Of course, Social Security and Medicare are separate and outside this budget, but and they're funded separately as well. But in terms of what we actually spend every year in appropriated funds, this green of the military is the lion's share, and it's over $1 trillion now. And just compare education, which is a tiny fraction of that, health, and so on. American taxpayers pay a very heavy price for this military footprint in the Middle East and around the world. And of course, blowback happens too, the most notably 9/11, which, as you know, Osama bin Laden particularly cited the U.S. presence in the Middle East and the Arab countries as one of his reasons for supporting this attack. And by the way, speaking of U.S. allies and enemies, the New York Times, after 9/11, wanted to get some quotes from Israel about what they thought about it. And they managed to reach Benjamin Netanyahu, who was then out of office. And his sort of unfiltered first response was, "It's very good." And then he kind of, not very good, but it will help the Americans to understand and support Israel. So the Israelis were quite happy with 9/11 and its aftermath. And of course, the aftermath was the launching of what we call the War on Terror throughout the world, and especially in the Middle East. And that policy has been bipartisan in the best sense. It continued under Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, and now presumably Trump again. The administration changed, and maybe the flag changed, but the bombs were the same throughout the Middle East. And just as a reminder, we basically occupied Afghanistan for 20 years, but I ask you to remember that we began to intervene in Afghanistan in the 1970s. And the result has been not only the killing of many American troops and many more Afghanis, it created effectively a very reactionary, religiously extremist administration in Afghanistan, as opposed to the sort of secular modernizing trajectory that was playing out in Afghanistan before the U.S. began to intervene. And of course, then there's Iraq. We fought Iraq in Kuwait in 1990-91, and of course launched the full-scale invasion of Iraq in 2003 under what everybody understands today as false pretenses. And by the way, prior to this attack on Iraq, the U.S. had regarded the Saddam Hussein regime as effectively an ally. Through the 70s and 80s, the Ba'ath Party and eventually led by Saddam Hussein crushed the communist movement in Iraq, which we thought was a great idea. And then after the 1979 revolution in Iran, it launched a war on Iran, supported by Saudi Arabia and the United States. And the U.S. defended Iraq in the United Nations. We gave them covert aid. And on a personal note, I have to say, when I worked for General Electric in Lynn, Massachusetts, I worked in their steam turbine division. And the last civilian job we had before I got laid off was to build 2 power plants for Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the 1980s. So we defended them. Saddam Hussein used poison gas against the Iranians and some of his own citizens. We vetoed any consequences for that in the UN. And it was only after 9/11 that we decided that Saddam Hussein was inconvenient. It was partly with this ambition of reordering the entire Middle East to favor the U.S. and Israel. It didn't quite work out that way. And of course, remembering the way the U.S. and the Middle East had sometimes been an ally, sometimes an enemy of different forces in the Middle East, especially among extreme fanatic Islamist fundamentalists. Sometimes, as in Afghanistan, they were on our side. Sometimes later, as in 9/11, they weren't. But the one thing we know for sure is that U.S. policy in the Middle East had nothing to do with supporting democratic secular values and everything to do with whatever was convenient in terms of allowing U.S. and Israeli control. And the consequence, particularly of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, was to unleash a sort of resurrected and re-empowered version of Al-Qaeda and other jihadist Islamic groups. Modern Al-Qaeda got a new life in U.S.-occupied Iraq, and then ISIS, and basically created the kind of chaos in the Middle East, which we saw in the decades after 9/11. And again, the U.S. Involvement and sometimes being allied with some of these forces had nothing to do with values and democracy. It had to do with interests, U.S. power, Israeli interests, and oil. And part of that idea of reshaping the Middle East, which of course included Arab-speaking North Africa, was in 2011 the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Libya, of course, was no democracy, but it was a relatively prosperous, oil-rich country that was developing and providing pretty good benefits for its citizens. The U.S. decided to take the opportunity to overthrow Gaddafi, and this was when Obama was president and Hillary Clinton was his vice president. And I showed this little clip to remind you all that as much as people were shocked in 2016 and last year that Donald Trump could get elected president of the United States, it's a reminder that in 2016, there were 2 candidates who were sociopaths running for president of the United States, and one of them was Hillary Clinton.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died. Did it have anything to do with your visit? No, I'm sure it did.
I mean, she's quoting Julius Caesar, of course, and making a big joke of the fact that Gaddafi was captured and tortured by U.S. supported forces. And And of course,
Yes, we can.
Libya descended into total chaos as a result of that. What had been a fairly prosperous African country was divided up by different militias supported by outside powers, and Al-Qaeda and ISIS carried out atrocities throughout Libya. And Libya, basically, as a country, does not exist anymore. It's a battlefield of competing militias and so on. So that's the U.S. result of that intervention. And of course, Syria is another example. Syria had long been a authoritarian-ruled country by the Assad family and the Ba'ath Party. Certainly, the Syrians deserved better than that. But all the interventions in Syria by the U.S., its Turkish ally, and Saudi and Qatar financing, and of course, Israel, had nothing to do with promoting a better life for the Syrians. It had to do with weakening Syria and overthrowing a government that was allied with Iran and was considered hostile to the United States. And in trying to overthrow that government, of course, the U.S. allied with forces that were basically Al-Qaeda and ISIS, just as we had in Afghanistan. And the result was, as Jake Sullivan, who was Biden's and previously Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisor, was the understanding that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, as it was. The U.S. spent billions of dollars arming what were, in effect, Islamic jihadist and Al-Qaeda forces in Syria, which were regarded, like in Afghanistan, as the lesser evil to an independent secular state. And through the work of our allies, enabled foreign fighters to enter Syria from all over the world. And the result was eventually that these forces took control of Syria, and democracy would be a good idea in Syria, but whether these new forces controlling the country are worse than the previous Assad dictatorship, we remain to see. It certainly is true that what was once a secular, multicultural, multi-religious state. The view here you see is of the old city in Damascus, which has Christian churches of various denominations side by side with mosques, also of various denominations. Whether those minorities in Syria have any future in the country is a matter of uncertainty. And it's pretty likely that the historic Christian communities, Christians are were before the war between a 5 and 10% minority within Syria. Most likely those communities will mostly cease to exist in Syria, as they did in Iraq after the U.S. invasion also. Iraq was another country with a significant Christian minority. And of course, that's mostly gone. But on the positive side, as Trump said, we secured the Syrian oil. And we used the oil to help finance our own occupation in Syria, where we have probably 2,000 troops, and the helps to finance our allies in Syria, which principally are separatist Kurds that control large swaths of northern and eastern Syria, even though the Kurds themselves are a minority in this area. So just coming back, you remember we talked about how the colonial powers divided up the Middle East in the aftermath of the First World War, in the high point of having overthrown the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. The similar fantasies existed. I show you a selection of different maps that were published at that time of redrawing the borders of the Middle East. Of course, it came to nothing, mostly because the Iraqi resistance and resistance elsewhere made it impossible for the U.S. to have a stable occupation and install stable puppets in any of this region. But that was the intention at one time. This was considered, how can we redraw the map, just as the British and French did after the First World War. Now, of course, the big enemy that we hear all about now in the Middle East is Iran. And Iran, of course, has never threatened the United States. It's many thousands of miles away, and it's surrounded by U.S. military bases in the Gulf as well. And I remind you that when the Israelis and their supporters were pushing for the invasion of Iraq, their real strategic aim was to overthrow the government of Iran, because Iraq had already been pretty weakened by the first Gulf War, and Iran was Israel's main strategic competitor in the Middle East. And their policy had been to basically do regime change in Iran. So far, they have not succeeded, obviously. And the pretext for this, of course, they can't talk about the real strategic interest, is that Iran is supposedly seeking nuclear weapons. This was never true, especially in the early years of this campaign for war with Iran. But that was the pretext. This is Netanyahu at the UN with his famous cartoon bomb. And the reality is, of course, there's only one nuclear-armed country in the Middle East, or two, actually. There's Israel and U.S. military forces that have nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Every other country in the Middle East, including Iran, is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And every one of them is on record in proposing the Middle East be a nuclear weapons-free zone. And of course, any movement toward this is blocked by the United States on behalf of Israel. We don't officially recognize Israel as a nuclear power, but everybody understands that. And by the way, this idea of a nuclear weapons-free zone is not some kind of pie-in-the-sky fantasy. There are actually treaties in various regions around the world where all the countries have agreed to forswear the development and stationing of nuclear weapons, includes Latin America, Africa, Australia, and Oceania. The U.S. no doubt breaks that considerably because we have ships, submarines with nuclear weapons on board, but at least technically the nations in these areas have agreed they will not develop nuclear weapons. And of course, that's true in the Middle East for every country except Israel. So this policy of the U.S. has led to us being more and more isolated diplomatically. And I just give you a few examples. Shortly after the beginning of Israel's attack on Gaza, the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to support a ceasefire. Only 14 countries, including the U.S. and Israel, voted no. Mostly U.S. dependencies, countries that are, small and puppets of the United States. But the world was pretty united in demanding a ceasefire. Of course, the U.S. Did not allow this through its veto now to be enforced through its veto in the Security Council. And a similar vote accepted the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice that Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands was illegal and had to end immediately. And again, it was the U.S. and a few mostly insignificant allies and dependencies that voted against this. The rest of the world, shown here in green, voted in favor of this and Palestinian statehood as well. Now, why does the U.S. continue this policy? Well, one reason, certainly, there are the historic power reasons that I've talked about, but one important reason is the importance of the Israeli lobby in the United States. AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, is the most prominent. But in fact, the cause of Israel and Zionism has basically captured most of the mainstream Jewish organizations in the United States. And politically, they have an important sway, again, not so much in voting power, because Jews are a small minority in the United States, but in funding, political pressure, and so on. And a one-issue lobbying organization can punch above its weight, essentially, by making non-negotiable demands about that particular issue. It makes it more easy to pressure people to go along with it when it's all or nothing, as opposed to multi-issue organizations. But what's been happening lately is that the Jewish population in the United States, and particularly the youth, are becoming less and less infatuated with Israel and Zionism, and therefore are considered unreliable politically. Most Jews, the overwhelming majority of Jews, continues to vote Democratic, when in today's United States, the Republican Party is the sort of extremist supporter of Israel. And Israeli politicians are increasingly regarding the Jews in the United States as unreliable allies and are moving toward aligning with and mobilizing the interests of Christian evangelicals. And supposedly the largest pro-Israel organization in the United States is Christians United for Israel, which is led by an effectively anti-Semitic fundamentalist pastor. And I would point out here that the sort of pro-Israel evangelical movement did not grow up just spontaneously. Although Christian Zionism has a long history, the mobilization of it politically is relatively recent. And just like the right-wing fundamentalist movement that goes back to the 70s and 80s that seized abortion, was led to use abortion as a sort of political instrument. So the Christian Zionist sentiment was politicized also, in this case, principally by right-wing Republicans and by Israel and its allies. And CUFI, for example, was proposed as an organization in a book written by David Bragg, an American Jewish Zionist, who, when CUFI was founded, became its executive director. This is Christians United for Israel, led by a Jewish Zionist. And most of its funding comes from pro-Israel Jewish sources. And its current co-executive director is another Jewish American who was a former employee of AIPAC and of the Israeli embassy in Washington. So this politicization of right-wing Christian evangelicism in favor of Israel was not spontaneous. It was organized. But the result is that Israel has almost unmovable bipartisan support in Washington. This was a rally in Washington, D.C. in November of 2023. And there you see Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, the leaders of the Democrats in the Senate and the House, holding hands with Johnson, the far-right Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, at a rally organized to support Israel in this war. And although there is growing dissent from this pro-Israel policy among voters, especially among Democratic voters, pretty much early on in this Israeli assault on Gaza, a big majority of Democratic voters was in favor of a ceasefire, but only a relative handful of people in Congress proposed and actively supported a ceasefire. And you can see them here when they had introduced a bill demanding a ceasefire. And you can also see what all these people have in common. None of them are white Americans. They're all Arab, Black, and Latin and Arab Americans. And this was regarded, even though this was a small minority of the Democratic Party, it was regarded as so threatening that AIPAC and other pro-Israel lobbying organizations raised a fortune of money to defeat as many of these as possible. And they succeeded, spending tens of millions of dollars to defeat Jamal Bowman in New York and Cori Bush in Missouri. They spent $100 million all told in that electoral cycle, and are planning to spend many more. So this is what counts in U.S. pro-Israel politics: money, not particularly votes or voters. And as a consequence of this, of course, Israel is the recipient of massive amounts of U.S. aid. If you see this pie chart, this is the U.S. aid that goes to Israel. The next biggest ones are Jordan and Egypt here, who are given U.S. military aid in compensation for signing peace treaties with Israel. Of course, neither one is democratic, and likewise, almost none of the other recipients of U.S. aid. Cumulatively, the U.S. has given well over $100 billion of military aid to Israel. And if we correct that to be current dollars, many of those go back decades, it's hundreds of billions of dollars by U.S. taxpayers to support Israel. And even since Israel's attack on Gaza, the U.S. Congress has sent more than $22 billion in that year and a half alone to Israel, courtesy of U.S. taxpayers. Remember, almost all the important weapons that Israel uses in its attack on Gaza are made in the U.S., but they are financed by U.S. taxpayers, not by Israeli taxpayers. And of course, you all know we have much better things to do domestically with all of that money, not only the money that goes to Israel, but the money that goes to the Pentagon in general. But the political power in the United States decrees otherwise. Now, tellingly, President Obama, who is hated by the right-wing Zionists, of course, was very pro-Israel, and he was the one that signed the 10-year agreement of $3.8 billion a year with Israel that we're still in the middle of now. And when he met Netanyahu, although they didn't hit it off personally, Obama was, regarded it very important to express the close ties of the United States with Israel. He said, "We stand together because we share a common story." And that's when I want to talk about looking in the mirror. What is that common story? The common story is settler colonialism. And especially here in New England, we're used to these sort of gauzy pictures of the Pilgrims and the Puritans coming to settle in the New World, seeking freedom. And they themselves, as settler colonialists do, this is the first seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, and showing a caricature of a native person. And I don't know if you can see coming out of his mouth like a cartoon, it says, "Come over and help us." Because from the point of view of the colonizers, they always think they're helping the colonized people, doing them good, actually. And of course, as the Israelis say. And by the way, this is not just ancient history. Here on the lower right is the contemporary seal of the state of Massachusetts, which is basically an updated version of the same thing, showing a caricature of a native person with an arm carrying a sword over his head. And the motto in Latin here says, "By the sword," that's the first word, "we seek a quiet peace under liberty." There have been intermittent efforts to change this seal and flag in Massachusetts, but have not availed. And by the way, the ideology of the Puritans colonizing the New World was very much imbued with the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. They thought of themselves, like the ancient Hebrews, of entering a promised land. And it's not an accident that throughout the Northeast in particular, they name many of their places, settlements, after places in the Hebrew Bible. That's why we have Salem in Massachusetts. We have Sharon. Elsewhere, we have all over the New England states, there's a Canaan, a Jericho, a Bethel or Bethlehem, even Palestine. I lived years ago in New Hampshire, which is north of Boston, at what was the colonial frontier, and the town I lived in was called Lebanon. And just south of Lebanon was another town called Canaan. So this religious mission of promised land was part of the ideology of the Pilgrims. And by the way, despite this gauzy popular memory we have of them, they established a fundamentalist religious regime in New England, which was intolerant, like the Taliban in Afghanistan. Religious dissenters were not allowed to live in any of the Puritan settlements of Massachusetts. They hung Quakers in Boston, and of course, eventually had the famous witch trials in Boston and its neighboring places. So this is, goes against the, the sort of popular history that we have. As to coming over and helping us, of course, the reality was quite different. They conquered, massacred, and repressed indigenous resistance whenever it tried to rear its head. And like all colonialists, they could not understand why people resisted. It must be they just hate us. There's no reason why they resist, just like Hamas. They just hate Jews. That's why they resist Israel. And of course, that's the colonial story. And the North American continent was divided up by various European powers, like the Middle East was after the First World War, but ultimately incorporated with the United States under the doctrine of manifest destiny. That is, it was the destiny of the U.S. to expand over the whole continent of North America. This is a famous painting, which is actually in a museum in Los Angeles, which shows the spirit of the frontier, the railroads, the wagon trains, and the remnants of the indigenous people sort of fleeing in front of them. Manifest destiny, or the spirit of the frontier. And the U.S. expansion has a lot in common with Israeli expansion. And I show you this little animation, hopefully it'll work, that will give you that idea. So that's the United States today. The government of the United States controlling everything, with these little green patches of Indian reservations, somewhat similar to what exists in Palestine today. And remember Benny Morris, who was in the 80s, was a kind of liberal who wrote basically a scholarly expose about the Nakba. He became, like many Israelis, much more right-wing, and eventually identified Israel's process of expansion and ethnic cleansing with what happened in the United States. And in fact, years later, in an interview in 2002, I believe, he said his only quarrel with this ethnic cleansing was that it wasn't completed. They left some Palestinian Arabs behind, which is the source of many of the problems in Israel today. So who was once a liberal Zionist is now a far right winger, and this is the trajectory of many of the Jews within Palestine. So I remind you, I show you this. This is the Deer Island sewage treatment plant where I worked years ago, and this was the site of concentration camps, effectively, for the native peoples that were ethnically cleansed in Massachusetts in the late 1600s. And although we have monuments all over the United States and a Holocaust museum in Washington sort of dedicated to the memory of the Nazi perpetrated Holocaust, the Holocaust that the European settlers carried out on the native people in North America is barely known. And this is the current situation today. There was supposed to be a monument on Deer Island to the Native Americans that were incarcerated there. And of course, it has never happened to this day. And I just want to end looking at the issue of terrorism. Hamas, of course, is always called a terrorist organization. There's no doubt that some of its supporters and of other organizations have committed atrocities, that is, killed civilians, although they're much exaggerated. The organization is not terrorist. It's a resistance organization, although in war, members of armies or informal armies always commit atrocities. And that, of course, is true of the leaders of Israel as well. The leader of what was called the Irgun, the Israeli military organization, was Menachem Begin, who planned the blowing up of the King David Hotel in 1946, and Yitzhak Shamir, who organized the assassination of Count Bernadotte and others in the aftermath of the Israeli independence, became prime ministers of Israel. And there are monuments all over Israel in their memory. And by the way, this is the antecedent of what became the Likud party. And still today, its map shows Israel, the land of Israel, including both Palestine and Jordan. And that's still officially their position. And of course, they say that, the Zionists committed terrorism in a good cause, and the Arabs are committing it in a bad cause. So theirs was legitimate, and the Palestinian terrorism is not. And even Ehud Barak, who was prime minister of Israel, said if he'd been a Palestinian, he would have joined a terror organization himself. And just as a reminder of how fluid this concept of terrorism is, Nelson Mandela, the leader of the liberation movement in apartheid South Africa, was still considered officially a terrorist in the United States until 2008, long after he served as the Democratic president of South Africa. And then coming home, I want to remind you of some events in our own history. In 1831, one of the most famous uprising of enslaved people took place in Virginia, led by Nat Turner. And they committed what anyone would say is atrocities. They killed both plantation owners and their families. As many as 50-something people were killed. We don't cheer for that, of course, but we wouldn't talk about an uprising like that and the murders committed by it without understanding that the source was slavery and not the sort of savagery and barbarism of the people who revolted against it. And in this contemporary woodcut shows Nat Turner being captured by a slaveholder months after the revolt began. And we would ask ourselves, which is the real terrorist in this picture? The one who resisted slavery and may have committed some crimes, or the perpetrators of slavery that committed crimes in the millions? And by the way, Nat Turner, when he was arrested and tried, he was hung in the town in Virginia then called Jerusalem. So when we see that some individuals do terrible things, I like to remember the famous poem by W.H. Auden, who wrote it at the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1st, 1939. And he says simply, I think what's true, I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. And I'll leave the last comment to a Native American leader in Oakland, California, where my son was living at the time. And she said, rightly, the blueprint used to create genocide in Gaza and throughout the world was pulled from the playbook created by the United States government on American Indians here. And I leave you with this recent cartoon that shows, on the one hand, Palestine and Israel, on the other, the United States, with the common expression, God promised us this land. And I make these parallels to inform us about how we can change the future. We can't change the past, obviously, but we do have it in our ability to change the future, and that's what I hope these sessions contribute to. So I'll stop there and see if we have questions and so on.
Thank you.
Oh, share. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. I have learned so much from you in the past 4 sessions. I feel like this should be required watching for all U.S. citizens, all Americans, everyone, everywhere.
It's the opposite of required, unfortunately. It's forbidden. It's forbidden history.
I mean, crazy. I also want to thank MAPPA for putting on this series. I want to thank my co-moderators, Zarina and Cole. There are a lot of questions that people have, and we are going to be taking them out of the chat. So if you can put your questions in the chat, that would be great. And Zarina, could you start the, maybe if you want to spotlight also Zarina, Cole, and if you could start with the first question, that would be great.
Okay, the first question I have is been repeated a couple times, so I'm just going to say it. After watching your four-part series on Gaza Context, what would be your suggestion for getting Israel on the right or correct side of history? Jeff.
Well, we have to get the United States on the right side of history. Israel could not carry out its existence in the way it does without the full-scale diplomatic, financial, and military support of the United States. Of course, most of us here live in the United States. That's our task, to me, is to take the U.S. thumb off the scale. And without U.S. support at the level it is now, I think Israel would be compelled to negotiate seriously with its Palestinian population. And what the outcome of that would be, we can't say. But right now, the power disparity is so great that Israel is not compelled to really come to grips with the issue of its own history and of negotiating some kind of reasonable living arrangement with the Palestinians. And what that will be is not for us to determine. It's for the Palestinians to determine what their goals are, whether it's two states or one state with full citizenship and so on. But what we can do for the United States is stop our government from standing in the way. And I think that's crucial. By the way, if Israel had to pay the full freight for its military policy without the support of American taxpayers, I think there would be a lot more pressure than exists today for them to make changes. And by the way, Israel is not a poor country. I'm not opposed to foreign aid if it means feeding the hungry and so on. Israel is a rich country. It has a per capita gross national product that's greater than most of the European allies of the United States. So there's no rational reason why U.S. taxpayers should underwrite its military budget. If it wants to defend itself, as it has a right to do, defend its citizens, it doesn't have a right to ask Americans to pay for it. And if we stop doing that, I think there would be a lot more incentive for change within Israel than there is now.
Would you like for me to ask a next question, Julie?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
There's a question
go ahead.
here
Yeah.
about who funds AIPAC.
Well, it's, primarily wealthy Jews in the United States and indirectly the Israeli government. They don't directly finance AIPAC, but they do finance AIPAC-like political operations within the United States. The budget of Israel for what they call international diplomacy or propaganda is $150 million a year, which is not small change. Most of that goes to the United States. But AIPAC is funded by rich oligarchs primarily. And of course, that's one of the main problems, not just on the question of Israel, but of the whole U.S. political scene, is that money has, a sort of outlandish influence on U.S. politics and policies, not just on Israel, but that's part of it. If we had laws that forbade the corruption of the political process by money, it would make it easier to change our policy toward Israel as well as many other things. So, and by the way, I want to emphasize that, I tried to say, the political movement supporting Israel that supposedly in the evangelical community was mobilized politically by the right wing in the United States and by Israel. And it didn't just spontaneously arise, even though the ideology, the wistfulness of a sort of Christian Zionism goes back hundreds of years. Its political mobilization was organized primarily by Israel and its supporters, and not Christians, by the way. So.
Okay, I have another question here is it a fact that the U.S. is stealing Syria's oil? Is this addressed by anyone publicly? Russia, the UN, Al Jazeera, anyone in Syria? Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, so the eastern part of Syria that is occupied by the United States and its Kurdish allies is where the oil and the wheat of Syria is grown. And this was one of the factors that greatly weakened the ability of Syria to resist foreign intervention, is that the economic power of oil and wheat controlled by the United States and its allies made it impossible to finance the government and to feed its people adequately. And so it led to the weakening, and that continues today, by the way. So the U.S. and its Kurdish separatist allies still occupy most of the oil-producing areas of Syria today. We have 2,000 or so troops and some unknown but larger number of military contractors occupying areas of Syria and supporting our allies in Syria.
I have a question here about Saudi Arabia, and if Saudi Arabia is developing renewables, and is the end of fossil fuels in the future, and do you see any movement towards that in the Middle East?
Well, we don't know. I mean, obviously, the wealth of Saudi Arabia depends in the first place on oil. Not only Saudi Arabia, but Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and so on. These are petro monarchies, basically, and none of them is remotely democratic, by the way, even though they are strong allies of the United States. In the long run, moving away from fossil fuels will be a threat to these countries. And that's why the Saudis in particular are trying to use their current wealth to diversify somewhat. Whether they'll succeed or not, we don't know. But for the time being, oil is the basis of their wealth and the basis of their importance in the world, and why the U.S. unaccountably supports these sort of undemocratic monarchies around the Gulf, even though we're supposedly, promulgating democracy around the world. Of course, in the Middle East, that does not apply. I think it never applied except as a rhetoric, but certainly not in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and all these other countries are effectively dictatorships, monarchist dictatorships, and their own people are repressed as well as their neighbors.
I have another question here. I don't know if you're familiar with this author, Tom Segev. This person asks, Thomas Baker asks, are the popular books by Tom Segev reliable in your view? S-E-G-E-V.
I think Segev, if I remember right, wrote a book about the Mandate period in Palestine when Palestine was united. And yeah, generally, there are a number of, sort of decent left-wing Israeli historians that are also, very prominent. He's one, Ilan Pappé and Avi Shlaim and others. Once Benny Morris was in that group. And they write effectively a true history written from a point of view of accuracy and values. And none of them are very welcome in Israel itself these days. There's another Israeli author who has written several books sort of debunking the idea of a Jewish nation in Israel. He still lives in Israel, but he's also not part of the sort of establishment mainstream. So they're all on the reading list, I think, that I've appended. People can look for them.
All right. Well, here's another question. And someone wrote, can you speak to the fact that Israel has never written a constitution?
Yeah, well, I mentioned early on, they haven't because they can't square writing a liberal constitution with the idea of it being an ethnically supremacist Jewish state. So you can function that way, but you can't write it down in a credible way. And by the way, one of the disabilities of the Palestinian Arab minority that are nominally citizens of Israel is that not only isn't there a constitution in Israel, there's no Bill of Rights, and there's no concept of equal protection under laws, which is one of the fundamental principles of most liberal democracies. They can't have those principles and have a Jewish state that privileges Jews at the same time. So they function in this sort of mishmash of laws, specific laws, and so on, but no constitution. They can't, and they can't even agree on who's a Jew. in Israel. I mean, the religious authorities and the secular authorities don't see it the same way. And so they kind of muddle along with those contradictions. But if you put it in a constitution, it would be very difficult to reconcile them. So there's never been an Israeli constitution, and there isn't today.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Do you know if South Africa had a constitution, a Bill of Rights, all these things?
Well, you mean under apartheid?
Under apartheid, yeah.
Well, it's a good question. I don't know. Obviously, they could not have had a constitution as we know it, but they got around it by defining the African majority as non-citizens of their state. So it was a democracy for white people, in effect, but obviously not for the majority of the population. I don't know whether they had a constitution in effect. Would be something to look into. And by the way, all through the period of apartheid, Israel had very close diplomatic, economic, and military relations with apartheid South Africa. And secretly, even when South Africa was under sanctions by the UN, Israel was supplying them with military hardware in contradiction to the UN sanctions up until the very end. So birds of a feather, so to speak.
All right. So yeah, you do have an extensive reading list. I saw that. I think when you sign up for the course, you get this reading list. So that is really nice. I looked at a few articles. I think we may need to post that again on the MAPPA site because people are asking about it. People want to know also, can you address the complicity of U.S. universities in providing technology to the Israeli military and targeting civilians and infrastructure?
Well, many U.S. universities have various academic and economic ties with Israel. They often have special programs to accept Jewish Israeli students, and research that's shared. MIT in Cambridge is a prime example. So the interests of Israel are basically intimately interwoven within the entire ruling political and academic structure in the United States. And that's why the students who support rights for Palestinians are demanding disinvestment. That's the D. Divestment is the D in BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And again, this is something that the supporters of Israel have managed to stifle. Free speech on Palestine is very much limited at most of the major universities, especially the greatest university of all, so-called Harvard and MIT. People have been fired for speaking up for equal rights for Israel or advocating the boycotting of Israeli goods and services. So again, the fight for a different policy around Israel and Palestine is a fight for democracy in the United States, and they go together.
All right.
Here's another question about money and money in U.S. politics. There's a question now if the money of Citizens United has been supported by the ACLU. Is that correct?
I don't think Citizens United was a Supreme Court case some years ago, which basically struck down any limitations on funding of political campaigns by big money. And I don't know whether the ACLU was involved in it in any way. Certainly, most of the progressive people in the United States opposed this Supreme Court ruling. It even overturned existing laws to limit and control money in politics. So it opened the floodgates. And so AIPAC, as a consequence, which was always, AIPAC never gave political contributions in its own name historically. What they would do is organize private donors to direct them to donate to who they wanted. And a few years ago, for the first time, AIPAC organized its own political action committee under this new Citizens United ruling that allowed them to raise unlimited money for political campaigns. And like I mentioned, they spent close to $100 million in the last political campaign in the primaries, primarily targeting progressive Democrats and representatives of color who are regarded by AIPAC as the sort of basis, along with the youth, as the basis for being skeptical toward U.S. support for Israel. And they succeeded in knocking two of them off on this issue. And of course, ironically, in all the campaigns and all the advertising and funding that went into opposing these campaigns, Israel was never an issue that they mentioned. The money had to do with supporting Israel, but knowing that Israel was not a particularly popular topic among Democrats, they seized on other issues to finance, to attack these people. And some of them had vulnerabilities of various kinds, but none of it was publicly about Israel, even though everybody knows it was a sort of open secret what they were doing. But in the actual advertising that they financed, it was never about Israel in these districts, these contested districts.
Okay, I have one here about, did Israel get help with nuclear weapons? It says from Israel, but I suspect either they're talking about U.S. or South Africa when apartheid ended. So
Israel was involved in the transfer of missile and nuclear technology to apartheid South Africa, and it seems that they jointly carried out a nuclear weapons test in the South Indian Ocean. Again, it's never been absolutely confirmed or not, but they certainly supported apartheid South Africa with weapons. There's no controversy about that, and had a close alliance, as they did also with the Shah of Iran before he was overthrown. At the same time, Israel was also intervening around the world in places where it was difficult for the U.S. to function directly in Central America and various countries in Africa. Israel was a kind of sort of mob ally of the United States during much of the Cold War, and one of the reasons why they were considered to have value, strategic value. They were doing things around the world that it was harder for the U.S. to do directly or openly.
I have a question that I thought of. Since our futures are similar, U.S. and Israel, and how we're following the dynamics of kicking out the Native Americans or Palestinians, respectively, from America and Israel, are we... is the world doomed? I think it is. I guess I want to say, can America change the course? I guess that's what I want to know.
Well, I think so. Again, it depends on your focus in history. If you take the long view, as I do, I'm kind of optimistic. But basically because it's hard to maintain these regimes indefinitely when they more and more oppress more and more people. But, in the short run, because we have a limited amount of democracy in this country and many places around the world, our rulers are capable of maintaining this policy. But I think it will get more and more difficult. And certainly in sort of world opinion, Israel and the policy of supporting Israel is getting more and more unpopular. Certainly in the third world, in Africa and Asia, it's almost unanimous. But now even within the former colonial powers in Europe and the United States, there's a real upsurge of opposition to this policy. And I have to think eventually it will change. And that's why taking the long view is why last time I showed the ruins of those Crusader fortresses and so on. Sometimes something seems permanent when you have a narrow focus, but when you step back and zoom out historically, they are seen to be temporary. France ruled Algeria for 130 years before Algeria became independent, and so that's my view. I just don't think you can permanently maintain these oppressive regimes when people are turning more and more against them. And of course, Israel itself is having a hard time keeping the lid on internally. Despite their preponderance of weaponry and so on, they have not been able to destroy the resistance. They certainly killed a lot of people, but the resistance is still there. And the Israeli army is exhausted. and more Israelis are thinking about making a life for themselves someplace else. And I think the long-term prospects for continuing the status quo are not so good. How long the long term will be, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think the trends are in a direction that says Israel in its present status cannot exist indefinitely into the future.
Thank you, Jeff. I think that's a good place to end. It is 4:30.
I see matches. Can I get them?
I was wondering if Cole would put the gala review on so we could all give our appreciation to Jeff, and he could see all of us.
Thank you, Paul. Someone called me a professor in the chat. I'm not a professor. I'm a teacher.
Yes.
But,
and there were a lot of questions in the chat about where people can see these, all 4 sessions, and they are on YouTube. So, and I think Serena in the beginning put the links in the chat. So, so please watch them broadly and send them broadly. And thank you, Jeff, for.
Thank you all. And by the way, if someone has a local group in Massachusetts that would like to hear a talk about these issues, I'm available.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Really
you. And thank you all for attending.
Yes, really appreciate the enthusiasm.
Thank you for all your comments. I really means a lot to me, as it would.
Thank all of you. It was great.
And thank you to Mappa, and especially to Zarina and Julie. You guys have been a team, a support team. I really appreciate it a lot. So we can continue this discussion somehow. People can email back and forth. Maybe even we can think about convening a session just to have discussion. I know I've talked a lot, and there hasn't been as much time for discussion as some people may have liked. I'm available.
I also have a comment. We're trying to put these on the closed caption TV locally, so we can have discussion groups there, and maybe Jeff could be invited to have that discussion, so we could do a more informative discussion. Just a thought in my end for
great idea.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you again.